tough questions that candidates are often being asked and find challenging to answer is, what is your current compensation package, all components? Should I be honest with the search consultant about this? What if you're on a low pay, and what if you think you are too highly paid? Will this turn off employers? How do you manage that? And then also people are looking at perhaps they ask for your compensation expectations, but what, do you go higher than what your compensation is at the moment? Do you go lower as not to scare someone off? I'd love to hear from you, Lisa, your advice and recommendations on how to handle these questions. Is there one response of dealing with an executive search consultant, but a different one if you're dealing directly with the hiring organization?
Yeah, I think it can be, it can be really tough. I would certainly, with the executive search consultant, I would be as open as possible with because we are, in terms of building that trust, we are on the side of the candidate as well, wanting that successful outcome and wanting everything to be aligned. In terms of the discussions with the employer, I mean, in the UK, employers can still ask candidates directly about their salary. I think, it could be slightly different in the US, and I think there is a legislation change coming in within Europe. But at the moment, employers can in the UK ask candidates directly about this. And so if you are directly asked by a client in a meeting, I would always say that, if you're happy to respond, the best honesty is the best policy. And obviously, if you feel you're underpaid at the moment, then there is a discussion around that. And I think the key thing there is to be prepared as well. So to understand what the market rate is for a similar role, understand what the expectations are of that role. And I think as well that a good way of getting around that is also to sort of say that is to tell the employer what range of salary you would be happy with in terms of your expectations. So if you're not comfortable talking about the sort of granular detail of your current compensation package, you can always frame it in terms of what your expectations would be and the range that you would be comfortable with. But I think that preparation around knowing what the market rate is for the particular role that you're interviewing for, and understanding your worth within that context is really important in terms of preparing yourself for those tough questions.
Thank you, Lisa. Alexander, have you anything to add here?
Well, those are tough questions indeed. And on the question of should the answer be different from the one you give to the executive search consultant to the one you give to the client, my advice and my opinion is absolutely not. The answer must be the same exact account, because you cannot give different figures to the executive search consultant and then give another figure to the client, because in the end, at the end of the day, we will talk, and if we realize there is a gap, that can create incomprehension. So from the beginning, give all the aspects of your package, not just the gross salary and the bonus. You have a car, say it. You have an LTI plan, say it. How much? What are the conditions? You are part of the management package, same thing, say it. I once had this candidate who gave me this salary at the beginning of the process. So he told me, okay, Alex, so my current package is 100 something, 150 plus 30K bonus. And after a few weeks of discussions, he understood that he was the chosen one, let's say. And he started telling the client, okay, so I also have free shares for about 20, 25K per year. I have an LTI plan. So the more we were discussing with the guy, the more we were discovering parts of this package. In the end, he told us, I want this to be taken into account in the offer, and it was a failure. We could not close the deal, and we lost time. So from the beginning, I always ask for the current package and the expected one. If it does not work for my client, I will not try to push forward at any cost, because in the end, if I think it won't work, I won't push.
Thank you. And it's very sound advice. Keep your story the same for both the search consultant and the client. And one thing as well, there's questions coming in, how do I work with a search consultant? I would advise you all that, you will build a relationship with your search consultant, and it's a relationship of trust, and you have to invest in it. So I think, it's be careful who you're working with. I encourage anybody, if you are looking to work with a search consultant, have a look at AESC member firms, and you can see that through the BlueSteps directory. Mark, in terms of current compensation, I know Lisa touched on this. In some markets in the US, it's illegal to ask about current compensation. How important is it for candidates to understand the local laws on pay transparency?
Sure, it's a fair question. And it comes up in the annual AESC breakout sessions that I attend every spring in New York. And different search consultants, particularly in California on the west coast of the US and in the Northeast, particularly in New York, they are developing rules around how compensation can be communicated. I've heard differing strategies in terms of how search firms and hiring firms are navigating these new waters. And I think every organization has a different opinion as to how to work through that. I would say as a candidate, it not dissimilar to when you're completing your annual taxes and you retain a CPA to provide guidance on taxes. It's could be in certain situations advantageous for a candidate to retain counsel or outside counsel for employment matters too. In a lot of cases, we're working with clients and candidates' attorneys on terms and conditions and employment agreements in certain cases, depending upon what the situation is. We see that more in private companies than publics, but in a number of our public clients as well, they develop employment agreements. So there's typically executive level interaction between candidates and outside counsel. And we just have to be cognizant as a search consultant navigating those waters that we're providing transparency and honesty. At the end of the day, it's got to create a financial incentive for the candidate to move the process forward and a career opportunity as well. And typically, if those two don't align, it doesn't make a lot of sense to continue the process. But it is an interesting trend, and it will probably become increasingly more complex as we go forward.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to address one of the questions that has come in here, and it's about just to be clear and to clarify with everybody here in the audience. The executive search firm does not take money from candidates to do a search. The executive search firm gets paid by the client for the search. And so if you are working with any firm that is asking you for a payment to help you get placed, that's not the right search firm to work with. I think you should look at AESC member firms where no one is going to ask you to pay them. We get paid from the client. So just to clarify that. Caroline, I would like to ask you a little bit about the current compensation may inherently be biased. For example, the lead candidate may be a woman who makes less than the second best candidate, who could be a man. Does this mean that she would automatically get a lower compensation offer because of, where she started?
That's a very interesting subject. And when I first started recruiting in technology, very often women were paid lower than men. But in my world now, with less than 20% of the candidates in technical leadership positions, supply and demand comes into play, with compensation for women many times being higher than her peers. Over the past several years, we've seen this trend of women being paid at equal pay or more than men in IT because they are in demand. We communicate this to our clients early on, and we help them to understand the reason that, women may be at a higher compensation level than some of the men on the slate. But at the end of the day, we present a number of candidates, and the client needs to choose between the best candidate and understand that at times the best candidate may cost more money.
Thank you. That is very good to share that with us. And Lisa, I'd love if you have any views on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the executive search process, it's an unbiased process which targets the best candidates really based on the skills, experience, and their approach. So when we get to that shortlist stage, the shortlisted candidates are typically all within the same ballpark anyway, I would say, from a remuneration perspective. But I certainly would echo Carol Lynn's comment there. I mean, I do a lot of work in the industrial industry and finding, there are a few, it's a supply and demand as well within that industry in terms of senior female leaders. So there can be a premium around those types of candidates. So I certainly wouldn't say that, there would be a bias against a senior female candidate, particularly within that industry. But it is a really interesting discussion and point to, yeah.
And also, I mean, there's some questions in about, when you're interviewing the candidates, and then at some point when you go back to the client, does the client at any time say, okay, from the advice that you've given them, they need to actually change the compensation package or, stretch the base salary? Does that happen? Have you had that experience?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. Sorry, just to jump in there, and I think it was either Mark or Alexandra mentioned this in the introduction. I think they will, obviously our interaction with executives within the client's industry and within the specific function that they're looking for, we have a huge amount of intel and understanding of that market rate, and it can be market driven. And if we see that there is a discrepancy between the package that is proposed for the role versus what they're actually needing within that role to make that success, then we will advise them that for the skills and the depth of experience that they are looking to recruit, they are going to have to revise their the proposed package.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's move on to assessing your offer. So from a candidate's perspective, when you get the job offer, and let's say it's a job that you really want, and the compensation is slightly lower than what you had hoped for, if the candidate set expectations right from the beginning in terms of target pay, what advice would you give them in how to respond if the package is lower? But also, what if they didn't actually set any expectations before receiving the offer? So Lisa, let me start with you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I would say that always the first step is to talk to us as executive search consultants about the offer. I mean, actually, a lot of times my client will come to me and say, look, we are thinking of offering X, Y, and Z to the candidate. How do you think that's going to land with the candidate? And then we really are playing that mediation role. And I'll give my view based on those sort of open communications with the candidates previously. It goes back to Alexandra's point of, if the candidate has been really open with us in terms of all the different elements of their current compensation, then we can have that then conversation with the client to say, well, look, I don't think that's going to take them forward enough. It's not going to meet their expectations. So sometimes we have, before the offer's made, we have that discussion to sort of guide the client as to whether or not we feel that that's really going to land well with the candidates. But I would say definitely if the offer comes in and it's lower than expected, the first step I would do would be to talk to us as exec search consultants to see if we have insight as to why the offer was pitched at that level. So perhaps the client feels that there's a certain area of experience that needs developing and it hasn't quite hit the top end, in terms of the basic salary hasn't quite hit the top end of the range. So that's the first stage. And then I think it's then a discussion as to whether or not we as a team, so the candidate and the exec search consultant, then approach the client to say, well, explain the reason why there is that disappointment and there's not the expected move forward, and then go back with a sort of factual based response as to what the expectation was and why, with those facts to back it up.
That is great. Thank you, Caroline. Anything to add here?
I definitely agree with all of the things that Lisa brought up. I would say if you're negotiating a compensation package on your own without an executive search consultant by your side, and the client makes you an offer that's not what you want, you have to decide, what are the things that make the job the one you want, and do those outweigh the delta in compensation. It doesn't mean you can't try to negotiate on some aspects of the compensation package that get you closer. I would suggest thinking about, a sign-on that is paid out over time and not all up front. What about guaranteed short-term bonuses or kickers based on achievements as you get into your role? Ultimately, you should have in mind what an acceptable compromise will be to help you get to yes. Search consultants can be so valuable here because we are straddling between the client and the candidate, and we are used to doing these negotiations between both. So we advise on what we believe is an acceptable compromise and then help to negotiate that. In the end, if the delta is too big and there is no compromise, then it may be that it's not the right fit for either party.
Thank you. That is a good, sound advice as we're looking at assessing your offer. So let me just, Alexandra, ask you quickly, should executives always negotiate compensation? Are there times when they should simply accept the offer or walk away?
Well, the answer is it's a tricky one because, well, they should not always negotiate if they are happy with what is being offered. But our role as executive search consultant is to find the right candidates for the clients, and in the closing phase to bring points of view closer together between what the candidates desire and what the client offers, because most of the time there is a difference and we have to bring that closer together. Unfortunately, sometimes doing that is just impossible. The gap between what the candidate desires and what the client proposes is just too big. So sometimes the candidates should just accept walk away. because accepting an offer at a lower level than expected can create frustration for the future. And it is not a good way to start a relationship with your boss. I had this candidate once. The offer he accepted was significantly lower than what he wanted, but he negotiated for months, and he finally accepted the offer quite reluctantly, let's say, because nevertheless, he was very fond of the company, he believed in the project, in the product, so he joined them. But at the first difficulty with his boss, with his manager, the question of his package was raised again. So always keep in mind when negotiating a new role that you have to be perfectly comfortable in the end with what is proposed and what you sign for.
Thank you. Good advice. So let us move on now to developing your negotiation strategy. Carol Lee, should executives be the first to mention specific numbers when you're communicating your expectations up front? Even if I'm not asked, should I say it?
You know, it's a tricky situation, but overall, I would suggest that as a candidate, you let the company mention compensation first. So you have a chance to think about how does that align with your expectations and how to respond. The best place to start for each party is to communicate ranges rather than specifics. You know, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but pay equity laws require that an employer indicate a fair and equitable range for the role when asked. So a candidate should ask. That lets you know whether or not the compensation range is in your desired range. And you can also then ask some specifics later, but at least you know, well, if I'm at 600K total comp and their range is at 400K, there's going to be a big uphill battle. So I would say let them start the conversation, talk in terms of ranges, and get to specifics down the road if you want to, if you desire, because there are pay equity laws that protect you from not getting into specifics in some states.
Thank you for that, Carol Lee. Lisa, any advice that you would give?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Carolyn has just said, 100%. I think it's better to let the client bring it up within the early stage meetings. And I think, those early stage meetings are really for you to get the buy-in of the client and really sort of, and once you've been able to do that, and once that relationship starts forming, it's actually much easier then to negotiate or pitch yourself at a higher point down the line. But I think if you take the emphasis off the remuneration at the beginning, focus, on understanding the opportunity, developing that relationship with the client, then I think it's a lot easier for you down the line when we get into those granular discussions.